What would you do if you stood before a statue carved from stone and it refused to move no matter how many hands, ropes, or machines tried to lift it? Would you call it superstition? Or would you dare to believe that heaven itself had anchored it to the earth? That question haunted everyone in the quiet seaside town of St. Mary's Creek, a place where mornings began with the scent of salt and the slow tolling of the church bell. To most, it was an ordinary parish, a handful of families, fishermen and farmers who gathered each Sunday beneath weathered wooden rafters. But that year, everything changed when the Virgin Mary decided to stay. Before we continue, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Let's see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary have reached. It began with erosion. The sea had been inching closer to the church for decades, gnawing away at the cliffside with every storm. The diocese finally ordered the relocation of the statue that had stood there since 1891, a life-sized marble virgin, her eyes cast toward the horizon, her hands outstretched as if calming the waves themselves. When the announcement was made, the townspeople gathered uneasily at dusk. They didn't speak of miracles or curses, not yet, but of sentiment and sorrow. For as long as anyone could remember, the statue had been part of their lives. It was where sailors prayed before voyages, where mothers wept for lost sons, and where candles flickered through countless winters. Now it was to be moved inland, to the new church foundation 2 miles away. No one liked it. But no one protested. Not until the morning they tried to move her. The fog that day was thick as wool, swallowing the outlines of the church and softening every sound. Elena Morris, a young journalist from the city, arrived just as the crew was setting up. She'd been sent to cover what her editor called a small-town human interest story. She expected old fishermen, sentimental priests, maybe a few photographs of crying locals, something light to fill a slow news week. But the moment she saw the statue through the fog, her stomach tightened. It stood there on the cliff, gleaming faintly in the morning mist, its face so serene it seemed alive. The figure's veil and robes were sculpted with such precision that the marble almost looked like folded silk. Beneath it, waves struck the rocks with a low, rhythmic thunder, as though bowing at her feet. Elena took a deep breath and scribbled in her notebook, "The Virgin of St. Mary's Creek, last day before relocation." She had no idea how wrong that sentence would be. The crew moved quickly, looping ropes and fastening pulleys. The foreman barked orders, his voice echoing off the church walls. A priest, Father Gabriel, his white hair wild in the sea breeze, stood nearby, silently praying. When the machine groaned to life, a heavy steel crane arm extended over the statue. The men tightened the cables, the gears grinding as the crane strained. Then, snap. The first cable broke. The workers stumbled back, swearing. The foreman shouted to replace it. Elena stepped closer, her camera clicking rapidly, recording the scene. They tried again. The crane roared, steel biting against stone, but the statue did not move. The marble figure stood perfectly still, her eyes lifted toward the gray sky, as if untouched by the chaos around her. One of the workers muttered something under his breath, crossed himself and backed away. "Father," the foreman called, forcing a laugh, "it's heavier than it looks. Must be the base stuck in the soil." But Father Gabriel said nothing. He only walked closer, knelt on the damp earth, and pressed his palm against the statue's base. He stayed that way for a moment, silent, reverent, then looked up at Elena. "It's not the soil," he said quietly. "She doesn't want to go." Elena almost laughed. Almost. But something in the priest's eyes stopped her. It wasn't madness, it was conviction. They brought more men, stronger machinery, hydraulic lifts. For 3 hours, the noise of engines and shouted orders echoed through the fog. Each time, the same result. Nothing. The statue remained immovable. Finally, when the crew stopped for lunch, Father Gabriel asked them to rest. He said, "Let us pray." Elena stayed back, watching as the priest and a few villagers gathered before the statue. They knelt, murmuring softly, their voices drowned by the sea wind. She lifted her camera again, but the lens fogged over. She wiped it. It fogged again. And that was when she noticed it. A faint fragrance in the air. Sweet, delicate, unmistakable. Roses. But there were no roses here. None had ever grown on this rocky cliff. Her breath caught. She lowered her camera slowly and turned toward Father Gabriel, who was now smiling faintly, his eyes closed. "She's here," he whispered. "She's always been here." When the fog lifted later that afternoon, the townspeople gathered again to see if the statue had finally been moved. It hadn't. The workers, frustrated and embarrassed, promised to return the next day with new equipment. But that night, under a sky clear as glass, the villagers swore they saw something strange. A faint light, soft and blue, glowed around the Virgin's face. At first, they thought it was moonlight reflecting off the marble. But the moon had not yet risen, and when they came closer, the scent of roses drifted once more through the air, stronger this time, like a blessing. Father Gabriel crossed himself and whispered, "She's speaking, not with words but with her silence." Elena stood frozen, her notebook trembling in her hand. For the first time in her career, she didn't know what to write, because how could she describe what she was seeing? A statue bathed in unearthly light, refusing to move, as if heaven itself had claimed the ground beneath her feet. As the waves crashed below and the town fell silent, a strange thought took hold in her mind, one she would never say aloud. Maybe she wasn't meant to move.
The next morning, the fog had lifted, but a different kind of haze seemed to hang over St. Mary's Creek, not of weather, but of whispers. News had spread overnight. Some said the statue was cursed, others said blessed. The fishermen crossed themselves as they passed the church, and the baker refused to open her shop until she'd lit a candle by the window. For a town so small, silence never lasted long, and this silence was heavy with awe. Elena returned to the site before sunrise, her notebook tucked under her arm. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the light, that faint blue glow that seemed to come from within the marble itself. Her rational mind rebelled. It had to be reflection, refraction, something scientific. But another part of her, the part that remembered her grandmother's prayers, whispered, "What if it wasn't?" When she reached the church, Father Gabriel was already there, standing before the statue. His breath formed clouds in the cold morning air. "You're early," she said, trying to sound casual. "I never left," he replied without turning. She frowned. "You stayed here all night?" He nodded. She wanted company. The simplicity of his answer made her uneasy. She took a step closer, crouching to inspect the statue's base. The ground around it was damp, but not disturbed. No sign of machinery or tools, just untouched earth. Elena sighed, forcing a smile. "Father, with respect, maybe the machinery wasn't strong enough. These things happen. We can't call it a miracle every time an engine fails." Father Gabriel looked at her, then really looked, with the kind of calm that makes you feel seen even when you don't want to be. "Do you believe in coincidences, Miss Morris?" he asked softly. "I believe in patterns and explanations." He smiled faintly. "Then keep watching. Sometimes explanations take the form of faith." Later that morning, the crew returned, this time with reinforcements, a larger crane, heavier chains, and a supervisor from the city. He scoffed at the locals, waved off their superstitions, and ordered the work to resume immediately. By noon, the noise was deafening again, steel grinding, engines roaring. Elena stood beside the priest, jotting down every detail for her report. Then the ground shuddered. At first, it felt like the tremor of machinery, but then it grew stronger. Tools fell, workers shouted, the crane's arms shook violently, and the engine stalled, dead mid-motion. And then silence, the kind that hums in your ears when everything else has stopped. One of the workers backed away slowly, his eyes wide. "It's not right," he muttered. "Feels like the earth's holding her." Elena's pulse quickened. She turned to Father Gabriel, who stood motionless, his hands folded in prayer. "Father," she whispered, "what just happened?" He didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the statue's feet, where a thin crack had opened in the soil. Elena crouched beside it. Beneath the dark earth, she thought she saw something glint, a small fragment of stone, maybe marble. But when she reached to touch it, the air shifted. The faint scent of roses again, sweet, fleeting, undeniable. Her fingers trembled. She drew back her hand. "What is that smell?" "Grace," the priest said quietly. "Elena doesn't smell like flowers, Father." "Sometimes it does," he said simply. Determined to find a logical answer, Elena began interviewing the townsfolk that afternoon. She met Maria Ortiz, an elderly woman with clouded eyes and a voice that still carried strength. Maria had lived her entire life in St. Mary's Creek and claimed she had seen the Virgin protect the town before. "She's been here longer than any of us," Maria said, pouring tea into chipped porcelain cups. "My mother used to say the Virgin turned her face toward the sea to keep us safe. When the soldiers came in '43, the harbor was spared. The men said they saw her glowing on the water, like a mother keeping watch." Elena leaned forward. "You think that really happened?" Maria smiled, her wrinkles deepening. "Child, I don't think. I remember. I was 10 years old. We all saw it." Elena hesitated. "And now you think this is another miracle?" Maria's eyes softened. "The world forgets fast. Sometimes heaven has to remind us." That night, Elena sat by her motel window, listening to the sea. She played back the recordings of her interviews, the priest's calm voice, Maria's certainty, and the wind howling faintly through it all. Her phone buzzed, a text from her editor. "Got the photos. Write the headline, 'Superstition Stops Church Project. Need your copy by Friday.'" Superstition. The word sat wrong in her chest. She looked out toward the cliff, where the faint outline of the church could still be seen under the moonlight. Something about it all felt alive. The following morning, she woke before sunrise and returned once more to the site. Mist rolled across the grass like breath. She found Father Gabriel lighting candles at the base of the statue. "She hasn't moved an inch," he said without looking up. I exhaled, her voice a whisper. "Maybe she never will." He smiled faintly. "Then perhaps that's the point." He handed Elena a candle. She hesitated, then took it. For a moment they stood side by side, their small flames flickering in the sea wind. When the first light of dawn touched the Virgin's marble face, something strange happened. The sea breeze carried a sound, faint, almost imperceptible. It wasn't words exactly, more like a hum, a breath, a whisper beneath the stone. Elena looked up sharply. "Did you hear that?" Father Gabriel nodded. "She's reminding us she's not gone." Elena's heart pounded. "Reminding us of what?" "That faith," he said, "isn't something you move. It's something you stand upon." Later that day, the workers packed up their tools and left. The project was postponed indefinitely, pending technical review. But for the people of St. Mary's Creek, no explanation was needed. They began leaving candles and flowers at the statue's feet. Children came with folded prayers. Fishermen made the sign of the cross before sailing. And Elena, the skeptic, the outsider, found herself visiting every morning, notebook forgotten, hands still. Sometimes when the world was quiet, she could almost hear it again. That faint, impossible whisper beneath the stone. It was not in any language she knew, but somehow she understood. By the third day, word had spread far beyond St. Mary's Creek. What began as whispers among villagers had become headlines in neighboring towns. Statue that refused to move, miracle or mechanical error? Cameras, reporters, and pilgrims began to appear, crowding the narrow road leading to the church. For Father Gabriel, it was both a blessing and a burden. He stood by the old wooden doors, greeting each visitor with the same quiet patience, though weariness lined his face.
He knew curiosity was not the same as faith. People came not to pray, but to prove. Elena, now on her 4th day in the village, felt caught between both worlds. Her editor wanted drama, a headline that would trend. But what she had witnessed, that eerie silence, the scent of roses, the statue's defiance, could not be packaged in a few sensational lines. It was something else, something deeper. That morning, a group of engineers arrived with scanners and instruments. They claimed the marble base could contain iron deposits that reacted to magnetic fields, creating resistance. Elena followed them closely, recording every step. One of the men, Dr. Collins, was confident. "It's simple physics," he said, kneeling beside the base. "Ground composition, weight distribution, mechanical friction. Nothing divine about it." Father Gabriel stood nearby, folding his hands calmly. "Then you should have no trouble moving her," he said. Dr. Collins smiled thinly. "We'll see about that." They attached new hydraulic straps, adjusted the crane, and started the engine. The noise filled the air, metal against metal, the smell of oil and heat. For a moment it looked as though the statue might yield. The straps tightened, the machine groaned, and then, with a deafening crack, one of the cables snapped. The statue didn't move. Gasps erupted from the crowd. The sound echoed off the cliffs like thunder. Dr. Collins froze. His instruments flickered. "That's impossible," he murmured. "The pressure wasn't enough to—" But he didn't finish his sentence, because the moment the machine went silent, the scent of roses filled the air again, stronger this time, unmistakable. Someone in the crowd began to cry. Another fell to their knees. Father Gabriel raised his hands in quiet prayer, his lips barely moving. Elena's throat tightened. She had been standing only a few meters away. She could feel it. Not the scent, but the stillness that followed. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. When the moment passed, the wind began to move again, gentle and warm. The sea shimmered below. And for a fleeting instant, Elena thought she saw something reflected in the marble surface, a faint outline of light, soft and maternal, like a woman's silhouette. She blinked. It was gone. That evening, she sat in the church alone. The pews were filled with flowers now, lilies, roses, even seashells placed carefully by children. The statue stood in its place, silent but somehow alive. Father Gabriel approached quietly, holding 2 mugs of tea. He handed her one. "You're still here," he said. "So are you." He smiled. "Neither of us could leave if we tried." Elena stared at the statue. Why her? Why now? He took a slow sip. "Maybe because people have forgotten what steadfastness looks like. The world moves so quickly now. Cities rise, faith falls, everything is temporary. But she's not. She reminds us that what's sacred can still stand firm." Elena's voice softened. "You think that's why she won't move?" He said, setting his cup down, "I think she's waiting for us to move instead." The next morning, pilgrims began to arrive from far away, from Maine, from Louisiana, even from across the ocean. Some brought candles, others just questions. But all of them, when they stood before the statue, seemed to fall silent. A young mother whispered a prayer for her sick child. A fisherman touched the stone and swore his boat had survived a storm that should have sunk it. An old man who had not entered a church in decades wept openly before her. And Elena, once the skeptic, found herself observing less and feeling more. She wrote in her notes, "It's not about movement, it's about presence. Something here reminds people that they are seen." Later that week, the diocese sent a formal investigator, Monsignor Riley, to assess the claims. A tall, sharp-eyed man arrived with a briefcase full of papers and a voice that carried authority. He questioned Father Gabriel, examined the equipment, even ordered soil samples. To him, miracles required verification, not emotion. But when he stood before the statue, his tone shifted. His voice faltered. For a long moment, he said nothing. Finally, he whispered, "This stone, it feels warm." Father Gabriel smiled gently. "It welcomes those who listen." Monsignor Riley cleared his throat. "I don't believe in sentimentality, Father, but I'll admit, something about this place is extraordinary."
He turned to Elena. "And you, young lady, you're the reporter, yes? What do you believe?" The question caught her off guard. "I believe in what I see," she said quietly. "And what have you seen?" Elena hesitated. She looked up at the statue, her marble face calm beneath the morning light. "I'm still trying to understand," she said. He nodded. "Then perhaps that's where faith begins." That night, a storm rolled in from the sea. Thunder cracked across the cliffs. The villagers rushed to secure their boats, their roofs, their candles. Elena watched from her motel room as lightning flashed above the church. And in that moment, for the briefest second, she saw it again. The statue, glowing faintly through the storm, the same soft blue light as before. Unmoving, unyielding, unafraid. And somehow, that sight, that stillness, calmed her more than any prayer ever had.
When dawn came, the storm had passed as swiftly as it had arrived. The sky over St. Mary's Creek was washed clean, painted with shades of pale gold and silver blue. The villagers emerged from their homes in silence, half expecting to find the statue damaged or gone. Yet there she stood, immaculate, untouched, her marble surface glistening with raindrops that caught the morning light like tiny jewels. Father Gabriel walked up the hill toward the church, his shoes crunching against the wet gravel. He carried his breviary close to his chest, whispering prayers of gratitude. When he reached the statue, he stopped and simply looked, not with the eyes of a priest trying to interpret a sign, but with the humility of a man who had just witnessed something far beyond his comprehension. Elena was already there, camera in hand. She hadn't slept. Her mind was filled with fragments, the storm, the glow, the silence afterward. "It's strange," she said softly as Father Gabriel approached. The lightning hit every tree around the church, but not her, not a single mark. Father Gabriel glanced at the sky. "She has weathered greater storms than this," he said. That morning, Elena decided to do what every journalist is trained to do: investigate. She called local archives, contacted historians, and searched the diocesan records. What she found was a story buried deep in parish history, a story of a statue that had once been moved before. More than 100 years ago, during the rebuilding of the old chapel, the villagers had attempted to relocate the same statue. The men who lifted it recorded that it grew heavier the farther they carried it, until they were forced to set it down by the edge of the forest. That night, lightning struck the very spot they had planned to place her, burning the ground to ash. The next morning, the statue had somehow returned to her original position, untouched, as though she had never been moved. Elena stared at the yellow document. Its ink faded with age. The handwriting trembled with reverence and disbelief. "She will not go where she is not meant to stand." She closed the folder slowly. A chill ran through her. Later that afternoon, she met Father Gabriel in the rectory. The old priest was writing in a small leather-bound journal, the kind filled with years of confessions, prayers, and quiet miracles. "Do you believe it's true?" Elena asked, placing the file on his desk. He looked up at her, his eyes soft but steady. "I don't have to believe it, Elena. I've seen it." "But why her?" she pressed. "Why this statue? Why this place?" Father Gabriel leaned back in his chair. "Perhaps because people here have forgotten to stop moving. They've forgotten to kneel. She doesn't refuse to move out of stubbornness. She stays because we keep running." The priest's words lingered in the air like incense. Elena said nothing, but deep inside, something shifted, a quiet stirring she couldn't name. The next Sunday, the crowd around the statue had grown to hundreds. Some came out of devotion, others came with skepticism and cameras. But when the church bells rang for Mass, a hush fell over them all. The villagers carried candles, the wax melting in the morning sun. Pilgrims knelt on the wet ground, their hands trembling as they whispered prayers in dozens of languages.
Father Gabriel spoke from the small outdoor altar. "We came to move a statue," he said, his voice clear and low, "but she chose to move our hearts instead." The crowd bowed their heads. Elena stood among them, her recorder off. She wasn't there to report anymore. She was there to witness. That evening, as the last of the pilgrims departed, a little girl named Clara approached the statue. She couldn't have been older than 7, her hands clutching a small wooden rosary. She looked up and said, "Mama says you won't move because you're waiting for someone. Is that true?" The wind blew softly through her hair, carrying the scent of roses again, faint but real. Clara smiled. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll wait with you then." Father Gabriel, standing nearby, closed his eyes. Sometimes he thought, faith sounded exactly like the voice of a child, small, sincere, and fearless. That night, Elena dreamed of the statue. But in her dream, the marble was gone. Instead, she saw a woman, barefoot on the damp earth, her veil shimmering in pale light. She wasn't distant or untouchable. She was human, radiant yet sorrowful, like a mother watching over her children who had forgotten how to listen. When Elena awoke, she couldn't shake the image. It was as though something had been placed in her heart. Not a command, but an invitation. She got up, walked back to the church, and knelt before the statue just as dawn broke. Her voice trembled. "If you are truly here," she whispered, "then let me see what you see." And for the first time in years, she prayed. Not as a journalist seeking proof, but as a soul seeking peace. At that very hour, Father Gabriel opened his journal again and wrote, "Faith does not demand that mountains move. Sometimes it asks only that we remain still, long enough to recognize that God has already placed us exactly where we are meant to be." He looked up at the statue one last time before closing the book, and though nothing around him seemed to change, he knew that something, unseen, unmeasured, had already begun. In the weeks that followed, the village of St. Mary's Creek became the quiet center of a mystery that no one could quite explain and no one could entirely dismiss. Pilgrims began arriving from nearby towns, some out of curiosity, others carrying candles and photographs of loved ones who were ill. The narrow roads, once used only by farmers and shepherds, now echoed with prayers in many languages. And yet, amid the growing attention, the statue remained exactly where it had always stood, serene, immovable, untouched by time or weather. Elena found herself staying longer than she had planned. What was supposed to be a weekend assignment had turned into weeks of observation, reflection, and something more personal, something she didn't have a name for. Her articles shifted in tone. They were no longer reports filled with facts and interviews. They became reflections, quiet, searching, filled with the same wonder that now lived inside her. Each night, she would walk up the hill after the last pilgrim had gone. The air smelled of wet grass and candle wax. Sometimes she thought she heard faint singing, the kind that doesn't come from any human voice, but from the stillness itself. She didn't know if it was her imagination or something divine, but she stopped trying to analyze it. She had learned slowly that faith didn't need to be understood. It needed only to be received. One evening, she found Father Gabriel sitting beneath the statue, rosary in hand, gazing out toward the horizon. The sky burned with the last light of sunset, and for a moment the statue's marble face seemed almost alive. "She hasn't moved," Elena said softly. "She won't," the priest replied, without looking up. "But we have." Elena smiled faintly. "Do you ever wonder why miracles happen in small places like this, hidden corners of the world?" Father Gabriel turned to her then, his eyes kind.
because that's where people still look up. In the cities, everyone looks down at their phones, their schedules, their worries. But here, when the wind passes through the trees and the bells ring at dawn, people still remember to look toward heaven. The words stayed with her. The church eventually sent a small investigative team. Priests, historians, even a few skeptical scientists came to examine the site. They measured the statue's weight, its foundation, the slope of the land. They searched for explanations, soil movement, humidity, shifts in the terrain, but none of it accounted for what they found. The marble of the statue had tiny imperfections, cracks that should have widened with time, yet hadn't. Its weight had increased slightly over the years, as if the stone itself had grown denser. When they tried to lift it, their instruments registered a fluctuation, as though the statue resisted being moved. The report, when published, used cautious words. No known geological or material explanation for the anomaly. But among the people of St. Mary's Creek, no one needed scientific confirmation. They already knew what they had seen, what they had felt. Months later, when the crowd had begun to thin, a letter arrived at the parish addressed to Father Gabriel. It was from an elderly woman in another town. She wrote of how her grandson had been ill for years, how she prayed nightly to the Virgin of St. Mary's Creek, and how one morning he had awakened without pain. In her letter, she said something that caught Elena's attention when Father Gabriel read it aloud. The statue does not need to move to work miracles. She moves hearts instead. That night, Elena sat in the pew long after the candles had burned out. She thought of all the stories that had been told, of the villagers' faith, of the storms that passed without harm, of the child named Clara, who still came every morning to pray at the statue's feet. And then she understood. The true miracle was not that the Virgin Mary refused to move. It was that she refused to leave. A year later, Elena's documentary was finally released. It was not what her editor expected. Instead of a sensational headline, it opened with silence, the sound of the wind moving through the trees, the gentle ringing of church bells in the distance, and Elena's voice narrating softly. There are places in the world where heaven seems closer, not because God descends, but because people remember to look up. The film ended with a shot of the statue, framed by candlelight, her gaze turned slightly upward toward the sky. Beneath her feet, flowers left by pilgrims swayed gently in the wind. The closing line of the documentary was one Elena had written the night she decided to stay. Faith does not always ask for movement. Sometimes it asks us to be still, so that grace can find us where we stand. When the credits rolled, the screen faded to black. But for those who watched, something lingered, a quiet ache, a sense that maybe, just maybe, miracles were still happening in the hidden corners of the world. And somewhere in the hills of St. Mary's Creek, the statue of the Virgin Mary still stood, silent, radiant, and utterly immovable. Not because she could not be moved, but because she was exactly where she was meant to be.